They called him a saint, but his prayers were written in blood. He healed the dying, yet whispered to the shadows at night. No one knew if he served God, or something far older. And when the sun vanished from his village, they finally learned his name, the Saint of Shadows. There was a time, long before the city swallowed the stars, when the air itself carried whispers of faith and fear alike. The 17th century, a Europe drowning in war, plague, and the endless silence of unburied dead. And somewhere between the ruins of belief and the hunger of men lay a forgotten valley, cloaked in mist, hidden behind mountains blackened by storm. They called it St. Auburn, though no one knew who St. Auburn was. Some said he was a monk. Others said he never existed at all. It was in this valley, during the cruel winter of 1623, that a young man arrived, barefoot, pale, his eyes burning with something between madness and devotion. He carried no possessions except a small book bound in weathered leather and a wooden cross, carved by hand, cracked through the middle. His name, he said softly to the villagers, was Elias Moreau. They had seen many wanderers before, plague survivors, deserters, thieves pretending to be priests. But Elias was different. He didn't beg for food or gold. He asked for something far rarer, a place to pray. At first they laughed. A holy man in a place God seemed to have forgotten. But when the fever struck again, when children began to cough blood and the church bells tolled day and night, the laughter faded. And that was when Elias began his work. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden stories. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now for you? I love seeing how far these untold truths reach. He went door to door, whispering prayers in a language none of them had heard. His hands trembled as he touched the sick, yet those same trembling hands drew the heat away from their bodies. Within days they rose again, weak, pale but alive. The villagers began to follow him, to bring their loved ones, their wounds, their fears. He prayed for them all. Soon they called him the Saint of St. Auburn. But every miracle casts a shadow. It was old Clara, the candle maker, who first noticed the signs. Every night after healing the sick, Elias would disappear into the forest, barefoot, silent, moving like smoke. She had seen him under the half-moon once, standing before the old stone cross at the edge of the woods, whispering words that made the air itself tremble. His shadow moved differently from his body, delayed, like it was alive. When she told Father André, the priest of St. Auburn's crumbling chapel, he dismissed her. "We should thank the Lord for his mercy," he said, "not hunt his servants." But doubt spreads faster than plague, and soon people began to whisper that Elias's book, that cracked leather-bound relic, was not a Bible at all, but something older. Something forbidden. They said that when he prayed, his voice echoed in the wells, that the dogs howled before he entered a house, that he didn't cast a shadow when the sun rose over the valley. Still, he healed them. Still, they needed him. And faith born from fear is the strongest kind. One evening, as the winter winds clawed at the windows, a boy named Luke fell from the old mill tower. His spine snapped on the stones below. By the time they carried him to Elias, the boy's body was cold. His mother wailed, "If you are truly blessed, bring him back." Elias said nothing. He placed his hands over the boy's chest, closed his eyes, and whispered something that made even the candles flicker. Minutes passed. The villagers waited, breathless, as the snow fell outside. Then, Luke gasped. His eyes opened. For a heartbeat, joy filled the room, until they saw his pupils, black as coal, reflecting nothing. Elias staggered back, trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered, "It wasn't supposed to answer." The villagers didn't understand, but they felt it. A chill, deeper than cold, had entered St. Auburn that night, and from that moment on, none of them slept the same again. Days turned to weeks. The snow thickened, sealing the valley from the world. Fires burned low. The church bells froze. And Elias, their saint, grew weaker. He spent hours in the chapel alone, praying not in praise but in fear. One night, Father André entered quietly, holding a lantern. He saw Elias kneeling before the altar, his hands bleeding. The book lay open before him, its pages filled not with scripture but with drawings, circles, symbols, spirals, drawn in what looked like dried blood. "Elias," the priest whispered.
"What have you done?"
Elias didn't turn. "What I had to keep them alive." Father Andre stepped closer, the light trembling. "This is not God's work." The young man raised his head slowly, eyes hollow, voice cracking with something between despair and defiance. "Then whose is it, Father? Tell me. When your God turned away, who else would listen?" The wind howled outside, shaking the chapel doors. For a moment it sounded like laughter. That night, the priest locked the chapel and forbade anyone from entering. He told the villagers Elias had fallen ill, but rumors grew like vines. Some said he was possessed. Others swore they saw him walking along the frozen river, speaking to his reflection. And then the disappearances began. Livestock first. Then Clara's daughter, then Father Andre himself. Every morning they found strange symbols carved into the snow, leading toward the forest. Every night they heard whispers, not from the trees, but from the ground beneath them. The saint of St. Auburn had become something else entirely. When spring came, no one dared leave their homes. The valley stank of death and fear. Then one night the church bell rang by itself. The villagers gathered, trembling. The chapel doors were wide open. Inside, on the altar, lay Father Andre's body. His eyes gone, his mouth sewn shut with black thread. And standing beside him was Elias. His robe was torn, his hands soaked in blood, yet his face was calm, serene. He spoke softly like a sermon. "Do not fear. The shadow is only his other hand. I have seen his face, and it weeps." The villagers screamed, some praying, some fleeing, but Elias didn't move. He opened his book and began to chant, louder and louder, until the candles burst into black flame. The walls trembled. The bell above the chapel cracked in half. And when dawn came, there was no chapel. No Elias, no villagers. Only ashes, drifting over the valley like gray snow. Centuries passed. Wars came and went. St. Auburn vanished from maps, swallowed by forest and myth. Only the mountain remained, and the strange silence that hung around it. In 1894, a group of historians rediscovered the ruins. They found fragments of the chapel, a rusted bell, and under a collapsed stone altar, a single, leather-bound book. The pages were faded, but one line remained clear, written in blood. "Light can only exist when the shadow kneels." To this day, no one knows what it means. The book is sealed, locked deep in the archives of Lyon, under the label Manuscript of St. Auburn. Scholars call it a hoax. Priests call it heresy. But sometimes at night, the guards swear they hear whispering coming from the vault, a voice praying softly, in a language no one alive understands. And though the centuries have buried his name, the world still remembers his title, the Saint of Shadows. The ruins of St. Auburn slept beneath centuries of moss and silence, until one autumn morning in 1972, when the past decided to breathe again. The expedition had been led by Dr. Camille Duret, a French historian whose obsession with lost monastic orders had already ruined her reputation. The university called her eccentric, her students called her cursed, she called herself curious. Camille's fascination began with a single entry she had found in an 18th century traveler's journal, a valley where shadows walk and the dead are not buried. They say the saint still prays, and the forest listens. Most scholars dismissed it as folklore. But Camille, she couldn't ignore the pattern. Each reference to St. Auburn, no matter the century, carried the same phrase: "The Saint of Shadows watches still." She spent 3 years tracing the legend, from dusty church ledgers to private Vatican archives. At first she found nothing but fragments. Then, one day she found a sealed file marked "Confidential, 1894, Lyon Museum." Inside was a single photograph, an open book lying on stone, its pages written in what appeared to be blood. The caption read, "Recovered at St. Auburn, language unidentified." That was enough to send her into the mountains herself. By late October, the mist hung thick, swallowing the roads. Her car broke down 5 miles from the valley. She walked the rest of the way. Locals warned her not to go. The elderly innkeeper in the nearest town made the sign of the cross when she mentioned the name. St. Auburn, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's not a place. It's a wound. Some wounds never close. But Camille was not a woman easily swayed by superstition. She packed her camera, her journal, and a small silver cross that had belonged to her mother, more for comfort than faith. By the time she reached the valley, the air felt different, heavier. The trees leaned inward as though guarding something sacred. Or cursed. The ruins were still there, fragments of stone walls half swallowed by ivy, a broken bell half buried in the earth. But it was what lay beneath that drew her attention. The ground trembled faintly when she stepped onto the chapel floor. Beneath the cracked stones, something hollow echoed. She began to dig. By the third day, she uncovered what appeared to be the foundation of a crypt. The entrance was sealed by centuries of mud and time, but as she brushed the soil away, the faint outline of a carving appeared, a symbol shaped like an open eye inside a circle. She recognized it immediately. The same mark appeared in one of the forbidden texts she had seen in Rome, a symbol used by a 15th century sect known as the Order of the Hidden Light. They were rumored to believe that God's true face could only be seen in darkness. Camille hesitated. Then she pressed her hand against the stone. It was cold. Too cold. Something clicked like the turning of a lock. The slab shifted, releasing a gust of air that smelled of earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Inside, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into blackness. She lit her lantern and descended. The crypt was small, barely enough space to stand upright. The walls were lined with niches that once held bones, now empty. In the center, upon a raised platform, lay a figure wrapped in decayed linen. At first, she thought it was a statue, until she saw the hands. They were human, perfectly preserved. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and saw a book resting on the chest of the corpse, the same book from the photograph. Its cover was dry and cracked, but the faint trace of symbols still shimmered. The title, barely legible, read, Liber Umbrae, the Book of Shadows. Camille reached out with trembling fingers and touched it. The air seemed to hum, and then she heard it, a whisper, not in her mind, but all around her, like the crypt itself was breathing. Light can only exist when the shadow kneels. She froze. Her lantern flickered violently, then went out. For a moment, the dark pressed against her, alive and cold. When she managed to relight it, the book was gone. The corpse's chest was empty, and the sound of breathing, slow, steady, echoed from behind her. Camille ran. She didn't remember how she made it back up the stairs, only that the forest outside seemed darker than before. When she finally reached her tent, she locked herself inside and stayed awake until dawn, listening to the whisper of wind that sometimes almost formed words. In the morning, she found something strange on her journal, a symbol drawn in charcoal, the same open eye inside a circle. But she hadn't drawn it. She packed her things and left the valley that day. Months later, back in Paris, she published her findings under the cautious title, St. Auburn, a forgotten cult of the 17th century. The academic community ignored it, but others did not. A week after publication, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from an old manuscript. Parchment yellowed with age, edges burnt. The text was Latin, but she recognized the handwriting. It matched her own notes from St. Auburn. At the bottom, in red ink, was a single line. He has chosen you to finish the prayer. That night, Camille dreamed of Elias Moreau. He stood in the forest, snow falling around him, eyes hollow yet kind. His voice was soft, almost pleading. You opened what I sealed. You must close it again. When she woke, her hands were covered in dirt, and the smell of iron filled her apartment. On her desk lay Liber Umbrae, the same book she saw vanish in the crypt. Its first page was blank. But as she touched it, words began to appear, written in fresh, wet ink. The saint does not die. The saint transforms, she screamed and threw it across the room. But when she looked again, the book was gone. Only a shadow remained on the wall, tall, human-shaped. and moving though she stood perfectly still. Over the following weeks, Camille's behavior changed. Her colleagues said she seemed distracted, haunted. Her lectures grew darker, her voice quieter. Students swore they sometimes saw another silhouette beside her when the projector lights dimmed. Then, one evening, she vanished. Her apartment was found in disarray. Every mirror was shattered. On the wall, drawn in black soot, were 3 words: "I saw him." A year later, a janitor at the Sorbonne discovered a locked trunk in the university's basement archives. Inside were Camille's field journals, her audio tapes, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever continues my work." The tape recordings were strange, her voice calm, almost reverent. "He isn't evil, not as we define it. He is balance. He is the breath between light and dark." Elias was not damned. He was chosen to carry both sides of God until the world remembered what it had forgotten. Then silence, a faint whisper, and finally, her last recorded words. "The Saint of Shadows never left the valley. The valley moved inside us." The university sealed the trunk, labeling it restricted material. But some say it wasn't the same afterward. Lights flickered in the archive halls. Books fell without reason, and every few weeks the night guard swore he saw a woman's figure standing by the basement door, whispering softly, as if praying. In 1997, a television crew from a paranormal investigation series attempted to document the St. Aubin ruins. They never finished the episode. Their footage, later recovered, showed the host reading aloud from a book she found near the collapsed altar. The moment she spoke the words, the camera began to shake violently. The image distorted. The last clear frame showed the valley, completely empty, except for a single figure standing in the snow. Head bowed, hands clasped in prayer. When investigators returned the next day, there was no trace of the crew, but their cameras were still running. And on the audio, faintly beneath the wind, a voice could be heard. "Do not fear the dark. Fear the one who prays within it." Today, the Valley of St. Aubin remains closed to the public. The French government calls it an environmental hazard zone. But some say at night, when the mist rises and the church bell echoes though no bell exists, you can still see him, a pale figure walking among the ruins, carrying a book that bleeds light. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear the same whisper that has haunted centuries. Light can only exist when the shadow kneels. The world had forgotten St. Aubin again, or so it believed. But in the age of digital resurrection, nothing stays buried. In 2023, a YouTube documentary channel called Echoes of the Past released a teaser that shook the internet. The thumbnail showed a foggy valley, a collapsed chapel, and in the corner, a faint silhouette of a man, pale and bowed in prayer. The video's title read, "The Saint of Shadows, the Forbidden Valley They Don't Want You to See." Within hours, it had 3 million views. The man behind the lens was Julien Mercier, a 32-year-old filmmaker who made his career chasing abandoned myths. Haunted castles, forgotten cults, secret orders. His documentaries blurred the line between skepticism and faith. But this time was different. This time, the myth whispered back. Julien had first heard about St. Aubin from a late-night podcast. The host mentioned an urban legend, that a historian named Camille Duret had vanished there decades ago while investigating a 17th-century priest who spoke to the dark. Julien dismissed it, until he found something she'd left behind. At an antique bookstore in Lyon, hidden behind rows of decaying manuscripts, he discovered a small locked box. Inside, a reel of film labeled St. Aubin, 1972, Duret. The shopkeeper said he'd bought it from a museum clearance years ago. "Useless old junk," he said. "But take care, the last man who tried to play it started praying in Latin before hanging himself." Julien laughed it off, but he took the reel. That night, in his studio, he set up his old projector. The film was grainy, black and white. At first only static, then faint shapes, trees, fog, the outline of a ruined chapel, and a voice, feminine, trembling. Camille's voice. "He's still here. The saint. He's still here. The film cut out. Then, a single frame lingered, the same open eye symbol, drawn in ash. Julian replayed it 3 times before noticing something impossible. In the corner of the frame, behind Camille's silhouette, was another figure. Tall and unmoving, eyes like 2 pinpoints of light. That was enough. Within weeks, Julian gathered a small crew, his sound designer Claire, camera operator Marco, and researcher Amira. They planned a full documentary shoot in the Forbidden Valley. They weren't the first. But maybe, they thought, they'd be the last. Getting in wasn't easy. The French government had sealed the area as ecologically unstable. Landslides, they said. Gas leaks. But to Julian, the secrecy smelled of something else. When they reached the valley, drones refused to fly. Compasses spun. Phones lost signal. Still, Julian filmed everything. Every rusted bell fragment, every moss-covered stone, every trace of the old St. Auburn chapel. They set up camp near the ruins. The night came fast, swallowing sound. At first, it was just the wind. Then, voices, whispers so faint they could have been imagined. Except, Claire recorded them. When she played back the audio, the whispers weren't random. They formed words. Kneel. The shadow kneels. Amira froze. That's Latin, she whispered. From Dureid's notes, umbra flectitur. It means the shadow bows. Julian smiled, adrenaline in his voice. Perfect. We have our title. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. The valley's air felt heavy, too still, like it was waiting. Marco swore the trees were closer each time they looked. Claire said her equipment drained battery faster when they filmed near the old altar. On the second night, Amira vanished. Her tent was untouched, her shoes still at the entrance. Only her notebook was missing. They searched the forest until dawn, calling her name. Near the riverbed they found footprints, leading to a narrow cave sealed with frost. Inside, on the wall, someone had carved the symbol of the open eye, and beneath it, written in ash, light can only exist when the shadow kneels. Her voice echoed faintly inside, distorted, layered over itself. Julian. Don't film this. He did anyway. The footage from that night never aired. But what happened next was pieced together from the fragments recovered by police. At 3:27 a.m., Claire's camera recorded Julian walking alone toward the chapel ruins. The fog was thick, his breath visible. His voice calm but trembling. Camille Duret, if you can hear me, show me the saint. Static. Then, a voice that wasn't his. He never left. The camera's focus snapped. For a second, a figure appeared, tall, in torn robes, face half burned by shadow. Its hands were clasped as if in prayer. Julian took a step closer. Elias Moreau. The figure turned its head slowly. The eyes, black mirrors. No reflection. It whispered. The prayer never ended. Then the camera fell. The final image showed Julian on his knees, whispering words too fast to understand. Around him, the fog seemed to pulse, shapes forming within it, countless hands reaching toward him. At 3:42 a.m., the feed cut. 2 weeks later, the authorities found the campsite. Only Claire survived, half-conscious, dehydrated, muttering fragments of Latin. He's light and dark both. He's everywhere. Julian's camera was found buried in the chapel ruins. Lens cracked. When investigators played back the footage, the video distorted after a few minutes, but one frame was crystal clear. It showed the valley at dawn. Julian standing among the ruins, eyes open, expression calm, and behind him, a shadow, massive, winged, stretching from horizon to horizon. He was holding a book, Liber Umbrae. Months later, the video surfaced online, uploaded from an unknown account. No one knows who posted it. Every attempt to trace the IP address led to blank servers registered under a single name, E. Moreau. Viewers reported strange effects, flickering lights, cold air, the sensation of being watched. Some swore they saw words appear on their screens in red text. You are part of the prayer now. The video was taken down within 24 hours, but copies still circulate on the dark web. People call it the digital psalm. Those who watch it too long say they start hearing whispers when the room goes dark. Today, The St. Aubern Valley remains sealed. No official record of the expedition exists, but locals claim a strange light sometimes appears above the forest. Not fire, not stars, but something that hums, like 1,000 voices whispering one name. Elias Moreau, the Saint of Shadows. And in a small apartment in Lyon, a woman sits by candlelight, writing in an old notebook. Her name, Claire Duval, the only survivor. Her eyes are hollow but calm. The pages before her are filled with words she doesn't remember writing. He showed me. He showed me what lies between light and shadow. It's not evil, it's balance. He prays for both sides. He prays for us. She closes the book, looks into the camera, and whispers, "He's not gone. He's waiting for the next believer." The candle flickers. The screen darkens. And just before it fades to black, a faint voice echoes, the same one heard centuries ago. Light can only exist when the shadow kneels. The moon was swollen that night, like a pale wound in the sky. Its silver light bled through the cracks of the chapel roof, touching the stone floor where Elias once knelt in prayer. But he was no longer there. In his place, a pool of melted wax and ashes marked where his presence had once bent time itself. The village whispered that he had vanished into the woods, into the realm of the shadows that once whispered back to him. Father Aldrich stood in that same chapel, alone. His voice trembled as he whispered the final psalm. "Lord, deliver us from the snares of the evil one." But even as he prayed, something inside him knew the truth. Elias had crossed a line no prayer could cleanse. Outside, the forest was alive. Not with the chirping of insects, but with murmurs, faint, human-like, echoing through the trees. A sound like many voices speaking the same name in different tongues, Elias. He had gone to seek the one thing he could not understand, the source of his power. But what he found was far beyond anything divine. Days passed, though the sun refused to shine. The world felt like it had slipped slightly out of alignment. The villagers said the candles would no longer burn properly. The water from the wells ran black for moments before turning clear again. And each night, a mist rose from the forest and crept to the edge of the town, like a warning that the earth itself was exhaling something forbidden. Father Aldrich gathered the remaining faithful in the chapel. The air smelled of damp stone and old fear. "Elias has become something else," he said. A woman cried out, "He was our saint." "He healed my son." Aldrich's eyes darkened. "Saints serve the light, but he now serves what hides behind it." And yet, in the farthest cabin near the edge of the forest, Elias was still alive, though not as before. His eyes were clouded and his voice carried a strange, hollow echo. He wrote symbols on the walls, symbols older than the cross. He murmured verses that made the wind hesitate. Every night he heard a voice, the same voice that once spoke to him in the well, asking, "Do you now see what faith really costs?" One evening, as he sat in silence, the door creaked open on its own. A faint light poured in, though the sky was dark. A child entered, no older than 12. Her face was pale, her dress soaked as if she had walked through a river. Elias looked at her. "You shouldn't be here." The girl tilted her head. "You called me." "I called no one," he replied. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Then why have you been drawing my name on your walls?" Elias froze. On the stone behind her, the symbol he had carved began to glow faintly, matching the light in her eyes. "Who are you?" He whispered. "I am what your prayers woke," she said softly. "The light that the church forgot." She stepped forward. "You think God made the night to hide evil? But the night is where he hides truth. The light blinds you. But in the shadows, you see." Elias felt his heart pound, the same rhythm that echoed in the forest the night he healed the blind. "Are you an angel?" he asked. She smiled again, sadly this time. "Would that make you believe me?" In the village, strange miracles began again, but they came at a price. The dead no longer decayed, the sick no longer slept, and those who had once been healed by Elias began to whisper his name in their dreams, begging him to return. Father Aldrich knew something must be done. He rode out to the forest, the cross clutched tightly in his hands. Each step of the horse seemed to sink deeper into mud that wasn't there. The trees seemed to breathe. When he reached the cabin, the windows were glowing from within. He kicked open the door, and his voice broke the silence. "Elias!" The sight inside made him drop to his knees. Elias stood in the center, his hands raised, his body surrounded by faintly glowing figures, half real, half shadow. Their faces were calm, their eyes empty, and among them stood the child. "Father," Elias said gently, "you shouldn't have come." Aldrich's eyes filled with tears. "You were chosen. You were meant to serve him." Elias turned slowly. "I still do. But tell me, Father, which him?" Aldrich stepped forward. "The Lord," Elias interrupted. "The Lord of what?" "The living, the light. What of the shadows he made? Do they not belong to him too?" The child turned toward Aldrich. Her eyes gleamed with silver fire. "The church prayed for miracles," she said. "And he gave them one. They just never asked who answered." Outside, the wind roared. The forest seemed to tremble. Aldrich raised his cross. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." But his voice was drowned by a sudden silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. The child stepped closer. "Do you know what happens when light refuses to touch the dark?" she whispered. Elias closed his eyes. "It creates me." Then the light in the cabin burst. When Aldrich opened his eyes again, the room was empty. Only ashes remained, and in them the faint shape of 2 footprints glowing like embers. He staggered out into the cold. The forest was utterly still. No wind, no sound. But above him, the moon had split in 2, a perfect fracture across its surface, shining like a scar. In the months that followed, the church sealed the entire region. They called it a plague of madness. No one who entered the forest returned the same. Those who did spoke of seeing a tall figure walking between the trees, his robes torn, his hands glowing faintly in the dark. They said he prayed still, but not to God. And in the ruins of the old chapel, where no one dared to tread, the wax on the floor began to move again, reshaping, reforming, into a single phrase in Latin: "Lux umbra servet," the light serves the shadow. Father Aldrich would return years later, old and trembling, to find that phrase carved deep into the altar, and beside it, a single candle, still burning. The villagers never forgot him. They whispered his name like a curse and a prayer both. Some called him the fallen saint. Others said he became something in between, a guardian of balance, neither light nor dark. But one truth remained across generations. When the mist rolls down from the forest, and the night feels heavy, those who whisper his name with honest hearts sometimes see a faint light near the trees. A man kneeling in prayer, eyes glowing softly, whispering to the shadows, the saint of shadows. The centuries were not kind to the memory of Elias. What was once whispered as a tale of faith and tragedy became a forbidden story, buried under new scriptures, burned in the sermons of cautious priests. The church renamed him the Lost Shepherd, erased his writings, destroyed the village records, and sanctified the ground where he last stood. But even time cannot silence a prayer that was half light, half darkness. It was the winter of 1891 when the silence was broken again. In a monastery perched on the cliffs of southern France, a young historian named Brother Lucien uncovered a sealed chest during restoration of the abbey's catacombs. Inside it were fragments of parchment, bound in flaking black leather, written in Latin and Aramaic. At the bottom of the chest lay a small glass vial containing wax mixed with blood. The title on the parchment was faded, but a single phrase remained untouched by age: De Sancto Umbris, of the Saint of Shadows. Lucien couldn't sleep that night. Each page seemed to pulse faintly under candlelight, as if ink itself breathed. The writing spoke of Elias not as a heretic, but as a gate, the last living bridge between creation's light and the abyss that followed it. He wrote, "The light fears its own reflection, and the shadow remembers the day it was born. I have seen both, and they have no quarrel, only men do." Lucien was drawn deeper each night. He stopped joining prayers, avoided meals, and began sleeping near the chest. The abbey's elder monks grew uneasy, hearing whispers echoing down the corridors long after midnight. whispers that sounded like two voices speaking through one throat. On the seventh night, Lucian dreamt of a forest, dead trees beneath a bleeding moon. A cabin stood at the center, door open, light spilling out. Inside, a man knelt before a child of light and shadow, both at once. The man turned his head slowly toward Lucien and whispered the same phrase carved in the old chapel's stone. Lux umbra servet. The light serves the shadow. When Lucien awoke, the vial was gone. At dawn, a storm broke over the coast. The abbey bell rang by itself, 3 slow tolls, deep as thunder. The monks found Lucien standing in the chapel, his robe soaked, eyes white as glass. Before him burned hundreds of candles that no one had lit. The air shimmered. He spoke without turning. He is not gone. He was never gone. Then, as if possessed by an invisible hand, he raised the old parchments and began to chant. Outside, clouds rolled backward against the wind. The sea turned to ink, and from the forest below, the mist began to climb the cliffs. The monks fled, save for the abbot, Father Renaud, who stayed, clutching the cross to his chest. "Who are you speaking to?" he shouted. Lucien smiled, his voice not his own. "To the one who stands between us and the dark. Elias?" "No," the voice replied. What Elias became. The candles went out all at once. Only moonlight remained, slicing through the stained glass. In that light, the figure of a man appeared behind Lucien, tall, robed, featureless. His hands were faintly luminous, his face hidden by shadow. Father Renaud fell to his knees. "Saint Elias?" The figure spoke, but his mouth never moved. The words echoed from everywhere at once. "I was never saint nor sinner. I was the cost of belief." Lucien trembled. "What are you?" The figure stepped closer, each footfall sounding like the toll of a bell. "I am the silence that follows every prayer." The walls of the chapel began to change. The saints in the glass windows turned their faces away, as if shamed. The cross above the altar cracked. "Why return now?" the abbot cried. The figure looked upward. "Because light has forgotten why it burns." Then the child appeared again, the same pale figure from centuries ago, eyes silver and calm. She stood beside Elias and placed her small hand in his. "The world has chosen blindness again," she said softly. "It prays without listening." Elias nodded. "Then it must remember the shadow." At that moment, the abbey bells rang a final time, but not from any human hand. The storm outside went still. The clouds opened like a wound, revealing the moon now split again, bleeding silver down upon the chapel floor. Every candle burst into flame, and in that light, Elias turned to Lucien. "Faith is not what saves men," he whispered. "It's what tests them." He reached out, touching Lucien's forehead. The monk gasped, visions flooding his mind. He saw the village centuries ago. He saw Father Aldrich kneeling before a burning cross. He saw the child walking into the woods. He saw both light and darkness kneeling before the same throne. Then Elias was gone. When the monks returned days later, they found the abbey empty. Only Lucien remained, silent and pale, sitting where Elias had stood. The parchments were gone, but carved into the stone beneath his feet were the same words, deeper now, glowing faintly even in daylight. Lux umbra servet. He lived only long enough to write one final letter before he died. He was never a saint. He was a mirror, showing us that faith without doubt is blindness, and light without shadow is nothing at all. Years turned to decades, then to centuries. The legend of the Saint of Shadows returned again and again, in villages, in dreams, in places where light lingered too long. Each time, someone would claim to see a man walking the edge between worlds, not haunting, not saving, only watching. And those who dared to whisper his name under a full moon would sometimes see him kneeling by the trees, praying with no words, his hands glowing faintly in the dark. He never asked for worship. He never punished or blessed. He only reminded the living that every light casts a shadow, and every shadow remembers the light that made it. The church never acknowledged him again, but they built silent chapels where the light was dim, and prayers were whispered rather than spoken aloud, as if to honor a truth too fragile for daylight. In time, People forgot the sermons and the rituals, but they remembered the feeling, that quiet sense of something holy and sorrowful, moving just beyond the veil of human sight. And when the night grew long, and faith felt lost, they still whispered the same words, "The saint walks where light refuses to go." Then, from the edge of the world, a faint whisper would answer, not from heaven, not from hell, but from the space in between, "I am here." And the candlelight would flicker, once for the living, once for the dead, and once for the saint of shadows. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.